What if the key to unlocking truly sophisticated AI isn't just about bigger models or more data, but lies in something fundamental? We've largely overlooked something, deeply tied to how our own brains process information over time.
That's a great question. And it's pretty much the central idea driving some really interesting new research we're diving into today. It introduces this novel concept called the continuous thought machine, or CTM for short.
Welcome to AI Peer Review, everyone. This is where we, dive deep into cutting-edge research papers, try to unpack the key ideas, scrutinize the evidence a bit, and explore what it all might mean.
And today, yeah, we're tackling a paper that proposes quite a radical departure, I think, from conventional AI architectures. It really puts these temporal dynamics front and center.
So the paper kicks off by acknowledging, the incredible progress we've all seen, these powerful language models, amazing vision systems.
Oh, absolutely. The progress is undeniable. But it also quickly points out that despite these huge leaps, modern AI still kind of struggles with certain aspects that seem, well, effortless for humans.
Like what exactly?
Things like real flexibility, um, learning efficiently from just a little bit of data, generalizing fluidly to totally new situations, robust common sense, and, let's be honest, transparency. It's often hard to tell how these models actually arrive at their conclusions.
Yeah, those are definitely the big hurdles, the things that make you pause and ask, okay, it's impressive, but is it really thinking?
Exactly. And the authors here argue that a core reason for these limitations might be that we're fundamentally maybe misunderstanding or just overlooking two critical components of intelligence: time itself and the really rich neural activity that unfolds within a system, over that time.
How so? What's wrong with how current models handle time?
Well, traditional networks often operate in these static layers, right? Or they process input sequences in discrete, lockstep fashion. There isn't necessarily this deep, internal, continuous dynamic process happening that's somewhat independent of the immediate input. It's more reactive.
Okay, so the CTM is trying to build that internal temporal dimension right into the core architecture.
Precisely. The continuous thought machine is designed as a fundamentally new neural network architecture, where neural timing and these internal dynamics aren't just like an add-on or an afterthought.
hmm
They're foundational.
And the hope is,
The hypothesis really is that by making time central, they can build models that might start to bridge some of those gaps we mentioned in flexibility, generalization, maybe even lead towards AI that's more interpretable because it has a discernible process unfolding over time.
okay, sounds ambitious. Let's dive in then. What's our mission for this episode? What are we trying to unpack here?
Right. So our goal is to first break down the unique architecture of the CTM, like how does it actually do this temporal thing? Then we'll explore some really fascinating properties that the paper claims emerged naturally from this design, like adaptive computation. That's a big one.
Okay.
And finally, we'll walk through the pretty diverse set of tasks the CTM was tested on. We're talking image recognition, maze navigation, even algorithmic problems. We want to see what evidence the paper provides that this novel approach actually delivers on its promise.
Sounds good. We're tackling some pretty fundamental questions about AI intelligence here. So let's start with the blueprint. What's the core conceptual shift? How is the CTM built differently compared to, say, a standard feed-forward network or even something like an LSTM?
Okay, the most fundamental concept really is that the CTM has these internal thought steps or ticks.
hmm
And these ticks are decoupled. They're separate from the length of the external input sequence or the number of layers in a traditional sense,
Decoupled, meaning,
meaning the model can engage in an internal process, like a kind of deliberation or computation, that unfolds over its own timeline. It's not just reacting to the input in one single pass, it's processing internally, step by step. And that processing takes time, its own internal time.
almost like a little internal clock or rhythm.
Yeah, you can think of it that way. And the building blocks for this internal processing are these things they call neuron-level models, or NLMs.
NLMs. Okay, that sounds different immediately. How does an NLM work compared to a standard artificial neuron we might see in, say, a deep learning model?
Right, this is a really key departure. A standard neuron, maybe one using a RIO-U activation, right? It takes a weighted sum of its inputs at a very specific moment, does its simple calculation, and produces a single output based just on that sum. It's stateless, essentially. Its output only depends on the current input right now.
Okay.
An NLM is different. The paper models it more abstractly, but the key idea is that each NLM has its own internal state and weights.
Hold on. Internal state within a single neuron. That's definitely not standard.
Exactly. It's quite unusual. And these internal dynamics, this state within the NLM, allow it to process not just the current incoming signal, but a history of recent signals, what they call pre-activations, to figure out its next activation state.
So each NLM effectively has a short-term memory of what just happened to it.
Yes,
Mm.
exactly. It remembers what signals it received over the past few internal ticks, and it uses that memory trace to decide its current output. This is fundamentally different from a memoryless static activation function like RILU.
Okay, giving individual neurons memory. Why is that seemingly small change so significant? What comes out of that?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. The paper claims that while this NLM concept is relatively simple to implement, and it seems to scale reasonably well, the critical outcome is that when you put these NLMs together in a network, they spontaneously generate these incredibly complex and diverse patterns of neural activity over time. This is the neural activity they kept highlighting in the intro.
So not just simple on-off signals?
Not at all. If you were to visualize this, like, imagine looking at figure 4 in the paper, you'd see these traces for individual neurons over the internal ticks. They don't just spike once or settle down quickly. They oscillate, they show rhythmic patterns, sometimes even chaotic-looking behavior. It's a much richer, more dynamic internal life than you typically see in traditional static networks or even standard recurrent networks.
And this dynamic activity, these patterns over time, become the core information the CTM works with.
Precisely. This dynamic activity, not just a single activation value at one point in time, becomes the fundamental substrate of the CTM's internal state.
Okay, so the NLMs process a history of inputs, creating these rich dynamic activity patterns. How does the CTM manage this history? How does it actually use this dynamic activity?
Right, so there are two main types of history it keeps track of. First, there's the pre-activation history we just mentioned. Think of this like a short-term sliding window, technically a FIFO structure. It stores the M most recent incoming signals to each neuron before they get processed by the NLM itself.
So that's the input window for the NLM's internal calculation.
Exactly. It gives the NLM that recent context it needs to compute its next state. And a neat little detail they mentioned is that the initial values in this history buffer, when you first present a new input, are actually learnable parameters. The network can learn how best to initialize its own short-term memory for each new problem.
Okay, that's the short fixed size input history. What about the history of the outputs, the dynamic activity itself?
All right, that's the post-activation history. This is where the actual outputs, the activations, or they call CTHAW, from all the neurons in the network at every single internal tick are accumulated and stored.
Every tick.
Every tick.
Yeah.
And unlike the pre-activation history, the length of this post-activation history isn't fixed. It grows with the number of internal ticks the CTM runs for a given input. So if it runs for T ticks, this history becomes a matrix, maybe neurons by T time steps. It's like a complete recording of the entire network's internal state trajectory throughout its whole thought process.
Okay. So the post-activation history is the raw data log of the CTM's dynamic brain activity, if you will. And this is where the core novel representation comes in this neural synchronization idea.
Exactly right. Neural synchronization, or the CPARS, is defined as the matrix you get by taking that big post-activation history matrix, let's call it ZE, and multiplying it by its own transpose, ZTOT.
Okay, matrix multiplication. What does that represent intuitively?
Intuitively, what this graphic matrix captures is the dynamic correlation or alignment over time between the activity patterns of every possible pair of neurons in the network.
So if the two neurons tend to fire together, or maybe one fires consistently after the other, over those internal ticks.
Their synchronization value will be high, exactly. If their activity patterns over time are uncorrelated or they're out of sync, the value will be low. It's capturing the evolving relationships between neurons based on their temporal activity profiles, not just their instantaneous values. The authors found this temporal correlation was more stable and effective, especially given those rich, often oscillatory dynamics we saw in Figure 4 compared to just trying to use static snapshots of activity.
That makes a lot of sense. If the internal state is inherently dynamic, you need a representation that captures those dynamics, those relationships over time, not just a single picture. But, you mentioned this matrix is neurons by neurons. If D is the number of neurons, that's a $D times D dollar matrix. If you have, say, 4,000 neurons, like in the ImageNet example, that's 16 million entries, that sounds computationally problematic.
You've hit the nail on the head. That's the critical scaling challenge. Computing and then using the full D dollar times D synchronization matrix for every downstream calculation would absolutely be impractical for large models. It just blows up.
So how do they get around that? They must have a trick.
They do. Their solution is a subsampling strategy, which they detail in section 2.4.1.
Subsampling, how does that work?
Instead of calculating the synchronization value for every single pair of neurons, J's, they randomly select a fixed, much smaller number of specific neuron pairs at each tick. They then compute the synchronization value only for those selected pairs, using the full post-activation history up to that point.
Ah, okay, so they get a sparse sample of the full synchronization picture.
Exactly. This allows them to create much smaller, fixed-size vectors that represent a sample of the overall synchronization state of the network at that moment. And it's these smaller, sampled synchronization vectors that are then used for the downstream tasks, like generating the model's output prediction or controlling its attention mechanism for the next step.
Interesting. So they're looking at the temporal correlations between just a subset of neuron pairs. Does the subset change?
Potentially, yeah. They discuss a few ways to do the pairing in appendix, B2 dense, semi-dense, random.
Yeah.
The random pairing approach, used in many of the experiments, involves picking random pairs each time.
Okay.
And a really key detail they mention about this random sampling is that they make sure to include self-pairs, like 80.
A neuron paired with itself? What does that capture?
The synchronization value for a self-pair, 80AAG, is basically the dot product of a neuron's activity trace with itself over time. This gives you a measure related to the total energy or variance of that single neuron's activity during the thought process. By including these self-pairs, the subsample representation isn't just about pairwise correlations. It also captures something about the individual dynamics of key neurons. They suggest this might allow the model to recover aspects of a more traditional static activation view if needed, but always viewed through this temporal dynamic lens.
Okay, that makes sense. So you have these subsampled synchronization vectors capturing a snapshot of selected temporal relationships between neurons, including self-relationships. How do these vectors actually drive the model's behavior? What do they connect to?
Right, so these sampled vectors are then typically passed through learned linear projection layers, just standard weight matrices to produce the model's immediate outputs. That could be the logits over classes in an image classification task, or maybe the value estimate and policy in reinforcement learning.
Got it. And if the CTM is using attention?
If it's using an attention mechanism, like for processing image features or sequence elements, then this projected synchronization vector is also used to generate the attention query for the next internal tick. So the model's decisions, its focus of attention, its interactions with the world, they're all directly controlled by this evolving dynamic representation derived from the synchronized activity of its internal processing. The internal state dictates the next action or focus.
Okay, I think I'm getting the pieces. We have NLMs making dynamic activity from input history. This activity across all neurons builds up in the post-activation history. Synchronization captures temporal correlations in that activity. A subsampled version of synchronization is projected to get outputs and attention queries. What's the glue? What connects the output of one tick back to the input of the next tick in this internal loop?
That's the job of what they call the synapse model. If you look at the simplified code or diagram in listing 1 or figure 29, the synapse model is essentially the function that takes the output from the attention mechanism, which processed the external input based on the previous tick's synchronization state, and combines it somehow, often just by concatenation, with the previous post-activation state from the last internal tick.
Okay, it combines attention output with the previous internal state.
Right. It then processes this combined information, maybe through a few layers they mention, potentially using a U-Net-style architecture here, to generate the new set of pre-activations for the current tick. These new pre-activations then feed into the pre-activation history buffers for the NLMs,
Which the NLMs use to compute the next post-activation state,
which gets added to the growing post-activation history.
from which synchronization is calculated, subsampled, projected for output, and the next attention query.
And the whole cycle repeats. Exactly.
Okay, let's trace that loop one more time just really quickly to make sure I've got it. Input comes in, maybe gets processed by a standard backbone like a ResNet. Then, for each internal CTM tick, the model uses its current synchronization state to generate an attention query. Attention pulls information from the input features. This attention output is combined with the previous tick's neuron activations by the synapse model. This generates new pre-activations. These update the short-term NLM input history. The NLMs process their history windows to compute their new activation outputs. These outputs update the long-term post-activation history. Neural synchronization is computed from this full history, gets subsampled, and is projected to give the model's output for this tick and also the attention query for the next tick. And this loop runs for, say, T key thought steps.
You've got it. That's the core loop. It's definitely a recurrent architecture, but the recurrence is happening along this internal dimension of time, driven by these history-dependent neurons and their synchronized dynamics, not just processing external sequential inputs layer by layer in the traditional RNN sense.
This is where it gets really exciting for me. What are the properties that the paper claims naturally emerge from this kind of architecture? One that explicitly prioritizes internal time and dynamics. They highlight a couple of big ones.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most compelling emergent properties they discuss is adaptive compute.
Ah, adaptive compute. That's kind of a holy grail in efficiency, isn't it? The idea that a model doesn't just blindly apply the same massive amount of computation to every single input, easy or hard.
Exactly. It's a major limitation of many fixed architecture models. You know, a standard deep network applies the same number of layers, the same number of operations, whether it's looking at a simple cartoon cat or a really complex, ambiguous scene. It seems wasteful.
So how does the CTM achieve adaptive compute? Is it something they explicitly build in?
It's more subtle than that. It seems to fall out naturally from the design, specifically from how it's trained. They use a variable internal tick loss function, described conceptually in the main text, and more explicitly in places like listing 4 for classification or listing 6 for the maze task.
Variable internal tick loss. What does that mean?
It means that instead of just calculating the loss based on the CTM's output after a fixed predetermined number of internal ticks, say T50, the loss function actually considers the model's performance and its confidence at every single internal tick up to that maximum T.
Okay.
The training objective is often based on finding the best result the model achieves at any point during that internal thought process. For example, it might be minimizing the loss found at the tick, where the model was also most certain about its prediction.
Ah, so the model gets rewarded for finding a good, confident answer as early as possible within its allowed thinking time, but it still has the capacity to keep thinking, keep running more ticks if it hasn't reached a good answer yet.
Precisely. Because the loss rewards finding a good outcome somewhere within those T-steps, the model implicitly learns to settle on answers at different times for different inputs. Harder inputs might naturally require more ticks to reach peak confidence or minimum loss.
So during inference, when you're actually using the model, you don't have to run it for the full T-steps every time.
Right. You could choose to stop the CTM's internal process early, maybe once its predicted confidence crosses some threshold or its estimated loss drops below a certain level. This means a simple, clear image might only need, say, 10 internal ticks to classify confidently, while a complex, ambiguous one might run for the full 50 ticks, using more computational resources because it needs more internal deliberation.
That's really powerful. It's not like some separate early exit mechanism bolted on afterwards. It's woven into the fabric of how the model learns and operates because of this temporal dimension. And you can actually see this happening in the results figures, can't you?
Yes, definitely. If you look at Figure 3 in the ImageNet section, Panel A shows how accuracy generally improves over the internal ticks. But the curve isn't necessarily linear. Panel B, and also Figure 14b for CFR 100, shows these histograms of when at which internal tick the CTM is most certain about its prediction for different data points. It's clearly not a single spike at tick 50. There's a distribution. Some examples get resolved early, others require much more thinking time to reach peak certainty. This visually demonstrates the model naturally allocating variable compute.
And Figure 2.
Figure 2 really drives it home by showing this trade-off. You can set a certain threshold and see how many ticks on average are needed to reach it and what accuracy you get. It implies you can tune this based on your compute budget versus desired accuracy. They also contrast this with adaptive computation time, ACT, a related idea, saying that while ACT is often applied post-hoc, here it feels like a more fundamental consequence of the architecture itself.
Okay, adaptive compute is a huge potential benefit. What's the other key emergent property they focus on?
The other one is the rich neural dynamics that we kind of touched on when talking about the NLMs. The combination of these history-dependent neurons processing information over time, interacting through the recurrent feedback loop via the synapse model. It doesn't just produce simple static activation values. It generates these really complex, evolving patterns of activity over the internal ticks for each individual neuron.
Right, those wavy, oscillating lines we saw in Figure 4.
Exactly. Those aren't simple ONO-FF states or smooth ramps. They are complex temporal waveforms. It looks much more like the kind of dynamic activity you might record from biological neurons.
And these dynamic waveforms across all the different neurons are the raw material that the synchronization mechanism is essentially analyzing and correlating.
Precisely. These rich, complex neural dynamics are the input, if you like. The synchronization matrix is the representation that tries to capture the meaningful relationships and coactivity patterns between these dynamic traces across the entire network over time. So the emergent dynamics enable this unique representation, and the representation, in turn, likely influences how the dynamics evolve in the next steps. It's this interplay they propose is key to more sophisticated, flexible processing.
Okay, this is a fascinating picture. We have the architecture laid out, NLMs, pre- and post-activation histories, neural synchronization via subsampling, the synapse model tying it together in a loop. And we have these core emergent properties, adaptive compute, and rich internal dynamics. How does this all translate to performance on actual challenging tasks? The paper puts the CTM through quite a gauntlet. First up, image classification on the standard ImageNet 1K benchmark.
All right, ImageNet. It's a good starting point, a complex, well-understood vision task. The goal here, I think, wasn't necessarily to blow away the state-of-the-art accuracy records, but more to demonstrate that the CTM can function effectively on this scale, and importantly, to observe how its internal temporal process plays out when dealing with complex visual data.
Makes sense. What was the specific setup for the ImageNet experiment?
They used a pretty standard approach. Take a pre-trained ResNet 152 as a feature extractor, a backbone. The CPM then takes these static image features from the ResNet and processes them internally using its temporal dynamics mechanism.
So the CTM isn't the whole vision system, but rather a processing module working on top of extracted features.
Correct. For this experiment. Looking at the specifics they provide in Appendix C.1, the CTM itself had about 4,000 neurons, T21966 Deckers. It ran for up to 50 internal ticks, T501. The NLM history length M was 25, and they used that random pairing strategy for the synchronization subsampling.
Any other key details about the setup?
One really interesting point they note, similar to the maze task we'll discuss later, is that no positional embeddings were used in the attention mechanism that the CTM uses to look at the ResNet features. This is important because it means the CTM has to figure out spatial relationships and where to focus purely based on the visual features themselves and its own evolving internal state, guided by the synchronization dynamics. It can't just look up where things are.
Okay, forcing it to rely on its internal process. So how did it perform? What were the accuracy numbers?
On the standard ImageNet 1K validation set, the CTM achieved 72.47% top 1 accuracy and 89.89% top 5 accuracy.
What does that stack up?
Well, as the authors correctly acknowledged, that's not state-of-the-art. Highly optimized, often much larger, modern vision models score significantly higher. But, and this is the crucial context, it's a very respectable result, especially considering it's the first major attempt using this fundamentally different representation based on neural dynamics for this task. It demonstrates the approach is viable and can handle complex image data reasonably well. They suggest future work could explore integrating CTMs more deeply into the vision backbone itself, or finding better hyperparameters, potentially boosting performance further.
Right, proof of concept rather than leaderboard chasing at this stage. Given the CTM's focus on internal process, what did they learn about how it actually goes about classifying these images over its internal ticks?
This is where Figure 5 becomes really illuminating. It visualizes the CTM's attention heat maps, where it's looking in the feature space over the course of its internal ticks for different example images. And you can see this fascinating dynamic pattern emerge.
What does it look like?
The CTM's attention isn't static at all. It often starts quite broadly, taking in the whole scene. Then it tends to zoom in to focus its attention on specific salient regions, maybe the head of an animal or a key object. From there, it might spread its attention out again to related areas, or sometimes it moves sequentially across the image, almost like it's tracing an outline or scanning features. They even show arrows indicating the center of mass of the attention moving over time, literally tracing out a kind of internal visual exploration path.
Wow, so it's really like the model is actively looking around the image, directing its focus based on its internal state and what it's figured out so far, tick by tick.
Exactly that. And remember, this is happening along the CTM's internal time dimension, which is decouples from any external sequence processing. The paper contrasts this with some earlier work that used RNNs for sequential image processing, but often that sequence was tied to generating an output like a caption step by step. Here, the CTM sequential processing is internal to its deliberation or reasoning process, separate from the final output generation. It reflects this idea of an internal thought process unfolding.
That's a very compelling visual demonstration of the temporal dynamics in action. Okay, moving on from images, the paper uses 2D mazes quite extensively. This task seems almost purpose-built to challenge standard models and really highlight the potential strengths of the CTM. Why is this maze setup particularly difficult?
Yeah, the maze task is cleverly designed. It's hard primarily because the model doesn't just have to classify pixels or recognize objects. It has to output a complete sequence of actions, a route, like up, down, left, right, or even weight, that leads from a starting point to a goal. This requires understanding the global structure of the maze and planning a multi-step path, which is much harder than simple local pattern recognition.
And they add that crucial constraint again, don't they? The one about positional information.
Yes, and this is absolutely key for understanding why the CTM might excel here. When the CTM uses its attention mechanism to look at the maze image features, extracted by ResNet-34 backbone in this case, they specifically exclude positional embeddings.
So again, the model has no explicit coordinates telling it you are here or this wall is at pixel X.
Precisely. It's forced to infer its own location and the overall layout of the maze solely from the visual features it sees through its attention window and its own internal state and dynamics. The explicit goal here was to push the model towards needing to build an internal world representation, a kind of cognitive map of the maze, much like we believe humans and animals do when navigating.
Okay, so a challenging task, output a sequence, plan a route, and build an internal map without explicit coordinates. What was the setup and training process like for these mazes?
They used a ResNet-34 backbone. The CTM processed these features with parameters like two 298th neurons, ran for up to T-K3 for 5 internal ticks, and used an NLM history M 1 in 225 light hours. Interestingly, for the maze task, they mentioned using dense pairing for the synchronization output. This means when they subsampled synchronization, they looked at the temporal correlations between all pairs of neurons within the smaller set used for output, not just a sparse random selection. Maybe capturing richer relational information was important here.
And the training. Planning a whole route sounds hard to learn all at once.
It is. So they used a curriculum learning approach, which is detailed in Appendix D.3 and Listing 6. The loss function was designed cleverly. Initially, it strongly encouraged the model just to predict the first few steps of the correct route accurately. As training progressed, the loss gradually shifted focus to optimizing the prediction for the entire path, step by step. This seems like a very natural fit for the CTM's own internal sequential processing. Learn the beginning, then extend.
Makes sense. So how did the CTM actually perform on this challenging navigation task compared to more standard baselines, like a simple feed-forward network or an LSTM?
The comparison is shown quite clearly in Figure 7. The feed-forward and LSTM baselines really struggle. They fail to achieve high accuracy, especially as the required path length in the mazes increased. Figure 7b, in particular, highlights how the LSTM performance just drops off a cliff.
But the CTM...
The CTM, in contrast, achieved high accuracy and, importantly, showed much less overfitting than the baselines. This strongly suggests that the CTM's architecture, with its built-in internal temporal processing and the dynamics emerging from it, provides a much better inductive bias for this kind of problems requiring spatial reasoning, procedural planning, and maybe that internal map building.
So the architecture itself seems better suited, giving it an advantage in learning how to navigate. Can we actually see evidence of how it navigates? Does it look like it's planning?
Yes, and Figure 8 is probably one of the most visually striking figures in the paper. It visualizes the CTM's attention heat maps over its internal time steps, superimposed right onto the maze layout. You can literally see the focus of attention, guided by those internal synchronization dynamics we talked about, methodically moving along a plausible path from the start location towards the goal location, tick by tick.
Wow.
They also plot arrows, showing the movement of the center of mass of this attention focus over time, and these arrows clearly trace out a sensible route through the maze passages.
That's really compelling. And because it's doing all of this without being given explicit positional embeddings, it really strongly implies it must be building and using that internal map, right?
Absolutely. The fact that its attention can sequentially trace a path through the maze, apparently knowing where to go next without being explicitly told where anything is in absolute spatial terms, is strong evidence that it has constructed some kind of internal representation of the maze's layout and its own relative position within it. The paper explicitly connects this kind of behavior to the cognitive science concept of episodic future thinking in humans, our ability to mentally simulate future possibilities, like visualizing navigating a route, which relies heavily on internal spatial representations or cognitive maps.
Okay, so it works well in the mazes it was trained on. How does it generalize? Can it handle mazes it's never seen before, maybe larger ones or ones requiring much longer paths than it saw during training?
Good question. Generalization is key. Figure 9 addresses this directly. They train the CTM on mazes up to 39 by 39 pixels in size, with paths up to 100 steps long. Then they tested it in two ways. First, on longer paths, more than 100 steps, within those familiar 39 by 39 mazes, and second, on entirely new, much larger 99 by 99 mazes.
How did they handle paths longer than the 75 or 100 ticks it was trained for?
They used a clever reapplication strategy. Run the CTM for its maximum number of internal ticks, say 75. Look at where the CTM's attention path ends up. Then mentally shift the starting point of the problem to that new location in the CTM's input features by masking out the old start and adding a new one, and just run the CTM again from that new intermediate point for another 75 ticks.
Ah, like breaking a really long journey down into shorter, manageable legs that fit within its thought horizon.
Exactly. And Figure 9a shows the results. The CTM maintained high accuracy even on paths significantly longer than those seen in training within the 39 by 39 mazes using this reapplication strategy. And it generalized surprisingly well to the completely new, larger 99 by 99 mazes too, although there was some performance drop on the very longest paths in those huge mazes, which is understandable.
And the visualizations support this.
Yes, figures 9c and 9d show visualizations of the attention path in these larger, unseen mazes. You can see the CTM continuing to trace out sensible paths, even navigating complex sections, providing visual evidence that it learned more than just specific training examples. The success, especially of the reapplication strategy, strongly suggests the CTM learns a generalizable procedure, a kind of algorithm for solving mazes, rather than just memorizing routes for specific layouts or path lengths it had seen before.
Okay, the maze results definitely seem to provide strong backing for the paper's claims about the CTM's potential for developing internal world models and cognitive maps. Things they argue are crucial for more sophisticated, flexible intelligence.
Yes, they clearly see this maze task as a key demonstration. By setting up a problem that heavily relies on these capabilities, route output, planning, no positional info, the CTM's architecture, with its inherent temporal processing, appears to be uniquely capable, at least among the models tested, of developing the necessary internal machinery to succeed.
All right, let's shift gears a bit. The paper also tested the CTM on more abstract, sequential, and algorithmic tasks, moving away from spatial reasoning. How did it handle something like sorting numbers?
Right, sorting. They had the CTM sort a list of 30 numbers. For this task, it doesn't use attention. It processes the sequence of numbers directly. Sorting is a classic benchmark, actually used by Graves and others back in 2016 when testing early ideas about adaptive computation. It's a good test of the CTM's ability to execute a sequential algorithm over its internal ticks and, potentially, show adaptive processing based on the data itself.
So how was it set up for sorting? What did it take in and output?
The CTM simply ingested the shuffled sequence of 30 numbers. Then, at each internal tick, it tried to output a prediction for the entire sorted sequence as it understood it up to that point. They used a connectionist temporal classification, or CTC loss, calculated over the sequence of internal ticks.
CTC loss, isn't that usually for things like speech recognition where you don't know the alignment between the audio and the text?
It is, yeah. Here, using CTC loss helps the CTM learn to produce the stable, final sorted sequence over its internal time steps, allowing for intermediate thinking ticks where the output might be unstable or incomplete, which fits the CTM's processing style. The parameters here were smaller than for the vision tasks. 2 Peto 266 hour neurons, 2 $5 ticks, 1 M 15 model time.
Okay. What kind of insights did this sorting task give us into the CTM's internal process? Did it show that adaptive compute again?
Yes. Figure 15 provides some really interesting insights. Panel A shows the average wait times. This is essentially how many internal ticks the CTM spends processing before it confidently outputs the correct value for each position in the final sorted sequence. And you see a distinct pattern. It tends to spend more ticks deliberating on the numbers at the very beginning and the very end of the sorted sequence.
Why might that be?
It's not entirely clear, but maybe finding the absolute minimum and maximum requires more comparisons or settling time. Even more interestingly, Panel B shows that these wait times are influenced by the data delta. That's the difference in value between adjacent numbers in the final sorted sequence. If there's a large jump between two consecutive numbers in the sorted list, the model seems to spend significantly more internal ticks processing around that point.
Ah, so its internal processing speed, its thinking time, dynamically adapts based on the perceived difficulty or irregularity within the sequence itself.
Exactly. It's demonstrating a fine-grained adaptive compute within the execution of the sorting task, driven by the specific numerical data it's working on. And Panel C also shows that the CTM generalizes well. It can still sort accurately, even when given numbers drawn from different statistical distributions than the one it was trained on, suggesting it learned a reasonably general sorting algorithm, not just how to handle numbers within a specific range or variance.
Fascinating. Okay, what about the parity task? Computing the cumulative parity of a binary sequence. That sounds like another classic test for recurrent networks.
It is. Parity, especially cumulative parity, is often used to test the memory and algorithmic learning capabilities of sequence models. In this setup, the CTM gets a static sequence of ones and negatives ones, like 64 in this case, and its job is to output the cumulative product, the parity, at each position along the sequence. So it needs to keep track of whether it's seen an even or odd number of medical ones so far.
Right, requires memory of the running state. How is the CTM configured for parity?
They use sequences of length 64. The CTM computed the cumulative parity over its internal ticks. Parameters included DD 100 and 244 neurons, and they experimented with variable numbers of ticks, T, and NLM history length, M. One difference from the maze task, but similar to how many sequence models are used, is that they did add absolute positional encoding to the input here. This makes sense because knowing the position within the sequence is crucial for calculating cumulative parity correctly. They also use semi-dense pairing for synchronization.
And how did it compare to LSTMs on this task? LSTMs are often pretty good at these kinds of sequence memory problems.
Figure 18 shows the results. Panel A indicates that the CTM generally outperformed the LSTM baselines they compared against in terms of final accuracy. Panel B reinforces the adaptive compute idea. Again, it shows that the CTM's accuracy steadily increases as it's allowed more internal ticks to process the sequence. More thinking time leads to better performance on this algorithmically complex task. And Figure 19 just visualizes how the accuracy across the entire sequence length improves throughout training, showing it's learning to correctly track the parity further and further along.
What about the attention dynamics? For a cumulative task like parity, you'd expect the attention to move sequentially, right?
You would. And Figure 21, top row, largely confirms that. It shows the attention patterns at different heads over time. As expected, the attention heads generally tend to move sequentially through the input sequence along with the internal ticks, effectively tracking the current position needed for the cumulative calculation.
Do the attention heads specialize?
It seems so. The paper notes that some attention heads appear to specialize in attending to the input value itself, the 1 or max 1. Others seemed more focused on the current parity state, positive or negative, and some showed alternating patterns, possibly helping to manage the flip-flopping nature of parity. It suggests a kind of division of labor among the attention heads emerged to solve the task.
Now, the paper is also commendably transparent about some, let's say, less perfect aspects or challenges observed, particularly with the parity task. What did they find there?
Yes, and that's good scientific practice. Appendix G.4 and figures like Figure 36 highlight that there was significant run-to-run variance depending on the random initialization seed. Some training runs converged nicely to near-perfect accuracy, while others seemed to get stuck in suboptimal states and perform much worse.
So the training outcome isn't guaranteed.
It seems sensitive to initialization, which isn't uncommon for complex recurrent systems. But Figure 37 shows something even more striking. Different random seeds didn't just lead to different final accuracies, they could lead to the CTM learning wildly different internal strategies for solving the parity task, as revealed by their attention patterns.
Different strategies, like what?
Some seeds learn the intuitive strategy, attend forward through the sequence, accumulating parity as you go, but other seeds learn to attend backward through the sequence. They still solve the task correctly, but with a completely different internal algorithm.
Wow, that's really interesting. The same architecture finds different valid solutions.
Exactly. It highlights that while the CTM can learn effective algorithms, the specific internal dynamics and the resulting computational strategy it develops can be highly sensitive to the starting conditions. And Feature 21, bottom row, also shows an interesting failure mode. When the trained CTM was presented with sequences that contained only yawns, and therefore never changed parity, its learned attention pattern sometimes broke down, suggesting the learned strategy might have been brittle or made assumptions that didn't hold for these edge cases.
That's fascinating, seeing these different internal thought processes emerge and also seeing their potential limitations. Okay, let's wrap up the task demonstrations by looking at the category of memory, reasoning, and control tasks. First up was Q&A MNIST. What did that involve?
Right. Q&A MNIST is a more complex reasoning task. It involves presenting information sequentially. First, the model sees a sequence of MNIST digits. Then it gets a series of interleaved embeddings that represent operations and indices instructions like retrieve the digit you saw at index 3, add it to the previous result, take the result modulo 10. Finally, it gets a signal prompting it to output the final calculated answer.
So it really needs to combine vision, Recognizing digits, memory, storing and retrieving them, and symbolic reasoning following the arithmetic instruction.
Exactly. It tests digit recognition, memory retrieval based on indices, and the ability to perform sequential modular arithmetic. It's designed to test if the model can follow a multi-step procedure involving different types of information.
How is the CTM set up for this multimodal sequence?
Appendix H-1 and H2 give the details. The CTM core had T-TAFE 11, 12, and $2 ran for 2 favololar ticks with NT50 Ys. They use separate input processing streams, one for the visual features from the MSIS digits and another for the instruction embeddings before feeding the combined information into the main CTM processing loop.
And how did it actually perform the calculation? Was it like it understood the whole instruction sequence and then instantly computed the answer at the end?
No. And this is where Figure 5 is quite revealing. It walks through an example computation step by step. As the different operator and index embeddings are presented sequentially over the external time steps, the input sequence, the CTM appears to perform the corresponding arithmetic step internally over its internal picks. You can see its internal state reflected in the synchronization output, changing as it processes each instruction. It literally seems to compute parts of the problem compositionally and sequentially, influenced by the incoming instructions in real time before generating the final answer when prompted.
So it's not just getting the right final answer. You can potentially see the intermediate computational steps unfolding within its internal temporal process.
That's what the visualization suggests, yes. It demonstrates that the CTM seems capable of following a complex, step-by-step logical procedure, distributing the computation across its internal temporal dimension, driven by the sequence of external instruction.
Very interesting. Okay, last task area, reinforcement learning, standard control problems.
Yes, they tested the CTM on some classic RL benchmarks: cart pull, balancing a pole on a cart; acrobat, a double pendulum swing-up task; and also a more complex navigation task called mini-grid 4 rooms, shown in Figure 26. These are standard environments for evaluating RL agents.
How is the CTM used in an RL setting? Does it replace the whole agent?
Essentially, yes. The CTM acts as the agent's policy network, sometimes called the agent's brain. It takes observations from the environment, like the cart's position and velocity, or the agent's view in mini-grid, and outputs actions, like push left-right or move forward-turn.
And they added a twist here too, right? Partial observability.
Yes. Crucially, they evaluated the CTM in partially observable settings, often called POMDPs. This means the agent doesn't get the full, complete state of the environment in its observation. It only sees part of it. To succeed, the agent has to rely on its internal memory of past observations to estimate the true state and make good decisions.
So this directly tests the CTM's ability to act as a stateful recurrent agent using its internal history mechanisms.
Exactly. The CTM, with its history-dependent NLMs and the accumulating post-activation history feeding into the synchronization representation, naturally functions as a stateful recurrent agent in this setup. Its synchronization output is typically fed into actor heads to select actions and critic heads to estimate future rewards, using a standard RL training algorithm like proximal policy optimization, PPO.
Makes sense. How did its performance compare to LSTMs, which are a very common choice for building stateful agents in POMDPs?
Figure 27 shows the learning curves. Across these different tasks, the CTM generally achieved performance that was similar to, or in some cases slightly better than, the LSTM baselines they trained. This demonstrates that the CTM architecture is certainly capable and robust enough to serve as a stateful policy network in RL environments that require memory and sequential decision-making under partial observability.
Did they look at the internal neural activity patterns again, like they did for ImageNet, but this time in the context of RL interaction?
They did. Figure 28 provides a fascinating comparison of sample neuron activation traces from CTMs versus LSTMs while performing these RL tasks. For the relatively simpler control tasks, cart pull, acrobat, both the CTM and the LSTM show somewhat oscillatory behavior in their neuron activations, which likely corresponds to the rhythmic movements needed to balance the pole or swing the acrobat.
Penny differences.
The key difference emerged in the more complex navigation task, mini-grid 4 rooms. Here, the paper highlights that the CTM traces exhibit noticeably richer, more complex, and less regular activation patterns compared to the LSTM traces, which looked somewhat simpler or more repetitive.
Why might that be?
They speculate that this might be because navigation involves a more complex, closed-loop interaction with the environment. The agent's actions, moving, turning, directly change its position and what it observes next, which in turn drives the evolution of the CTM's internal state in a highly dynamic and potentially less predictable way than the relatively simpler physics feedback involved in controlling a single pole or pendulum.
That makes intuitive sense. The constant feedback from exploring a spatial environment could naturally lead to richer internal dynamics, especially in a system designed to leverage temporal patterns like the CTM.
Exactly. And this observation links back nicely to the broader implications the paper discusses in its conclusion. They reiterate the idea that the synchronization matrix isn't just a static snapshot. It's potentially a powerful latent variable that captures the dynamic relationships between neurons and, importantly, maybe even encodes the consequences of the model's own internal actions or its observations over time.
And you mentioned earlier they speculate this representation, being based on temporal correlations, might naturally capture things happening at different speeds or timescales.
Yes, they touch on the potential for synchronization to inherently capture events or features occurring at multiple temporal resolutions simultaneously within the same representation. If true, that could be incredibly powerful for processing the kind of complex multi-scale data we encounter constantly in the real world.
And the idea of synchronization as a form of memory.
That's another intriguing speculation. They raise the possibility that these synchronization matrices, by virtue of capturing the story of the model's internal dynamic experience over a period of time, could function as a fundamentally different type of memory compared to standard mechanisms like attention weights or explicit memory buffers. It would be a memory intrinsically tied to the dynamics in the process of thought, rather than just storing static snapshots or pieces of information.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all together now. We've taken quite a deep dive into this continuous thought machine paper.
We really have. We've seen how the paper starts from this premise that intelligence might be fundamentally tied to temporal processing and neural activity, leading them to design the CTM architecture around these core concepts: internal ticks decoupled from external input, history-aware neuron-level models, NLMs, and using neural synchronization as the primary internal representation.
And we saw how this architecture seems to naturally give rise to some really fascinating properties, particularly adaptive compute, allowing the model to dynamically allocate its thinking time based on input difficulty, and the generation of rich neural dynamics, these complex, evolving internal activity patterns that form the basis of its processing.
Then we walked through the evidence presented across a diverse range of tasks. We saw respectable performance on ImageNet, coupled with visualizations showing a sequential internal observation process. We saw strong results in challenging 2D mazes, suggesting a capacity for building internal cognitive maps and learning generalizable navigation procedures, especially when denied explicit positional information.
We also saw it learning dynamic, data-dependent algorithms in sorting and parity tasks, although with some sensitivity to initialization. It demonstrated step-by-step logical computation in the Q&A MNIST task. And finally, it proved capable as a stateful agent in reinforcement learning, potentially exhibiting even richer internal dynamics than LSTMs in complex environments.
Yeah, it's quite a breadth of demonstrations.
So looking at the bigger picture, this research feels exciting because it's directly tackling some of those fundamental limitations we discussed at the start: flexibility, generalization, maybe even interpretability, by drawing inspiration quite explicitly from biological principles. The idea that intelligence isn't just about static network structure, but critically involves dynamic processes unfolding over time. It feels like a potentially significant step towards models that might be more adaptable, more robust, and maybe, just maybe, operate in a way that's a little closer to biological intelligence.
Absolutely. And if the CTM's success, even in these early stages, hints that sophisticated intelligence is deeply rooted in how information is processed and interacts over time through dynamic neural activity, it really begs a fascinating question for future research. What other temporal or dynamic mechanisms from biology might hold keys to building truly advanced AI?
Like what?
Well, are there other forms of neural timing we should be exploring? Different types of oscillations, more complex synchrony patterns beyond simple pairwise correlation, maybe mechanisms related to synaptic plasticity that operate on different timescales? How could we translate those biological principles into artificial architectures?
That definitely leaves us, and hopefully you, with a lot to think about. Exploring those further biological inspirations and figuring out how they might manifest computationally in AI architectures that really feels like a wide open and exciting frontier. We definitely encourage you to ponder the implications of temporal dynamics in AI, and perhaps even take a look at the CTM paper yourself to dig deeper into the technical details we've discussed today.